Welcome to Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steed Talker Capital, promoting prosperity and harmony to help you flourish in all areas of life. Join in as we explore the motivations and goals of real estate investors and how their ability to invest abundantly has provided them with the time and freedom to contribute to the world in a creative and thoughtful way. Now please welcome your host, Dr. Allen. Enlightened Investors, Dr. Allen here with Dr. Axel Meierhoefer, a retired Air Force officer. He started his first company in 2005, focusing on consulting, employee skill development, and program management. As a business owner, he began thinking about preparing for retirement. His research clearly indicated that investing in real estate would provide the best return on investment. This led to the development of an investment portfolio currently worth more than $1.5 million. Let's step into Axel's life to learn his secrets to real estate investment success. Welcome, Axel. Axel, bring to mind a memorable experience from your formative years that helped shape the person you are today.
Well, one of the things that I thought would be probably interesting for your listeners, and thank you, Alan, for having me on the show, is when I was pretty little still, my parents took me to meet the family for, I think it was a christening or something like that. And I got for the first time in person to meet an uncle of mine who took it upon himself to look for a house for his family. And in the process of finding a house, he was actually introduced to an old, one of those probably 150-year-old, kind of like mayor's mansion type of building, but it was really, really in bad shape. And instead of being turned off by that, he said, okay, well, it has one little area in the bottom right that is kind of habitable, so I think we're gonna move in there and then over the years see that we can get it done. And it was for me something very unusual because I grew up in Germany and everybody lived in a rented apartment, so owning something was already unusual, and then taking something like that on was even more unusual. And so then years later, I had a chance to visit again before I joined the Air Force, and he had actually just completed the renovation, and this thing was just one of the most beautiful places. It became like a 6-unit building where he had the top floor all to himself, and then on the left and right side.
What was the flash that finally made you leap into real estate investing?
The flash that finally made me get it was I was a program manager at the very end of my Air Force career, where we did a German Air Force, US Air Force co-located flight training center in New Mexico. And the combined goal of both military commanders, myself and the other US commanders, was we didn't want to have a ghetto on the base. We wanted to integrate the people in the community, which was a great thing. But when we talked to the city managers, they said, well, this is the 25,000 people city. So our builders that we have, they build maybe 4 or 5 houses a year. And now you want like dozens and dozens of new houses. And this will be tricky with financing and stuff like that. They feel a little afraid to commit to this. And so we went then to the military authorities and said, can we do something? And they said, yeah, one thing that is not that uncommon for off-base housing is to basically guarantee the rent, and the rent can be paid directly from the military budgets rather than from the person through their bank account, so that whoever owns the building doesn't really have to be afraid that they wouldn't get paid, even if a military person would, out of a service member would, out of some reason, not be as diligent as you would normally expect it. And so I initially, this is like the really, that was the hint with the sledgehammer kind of thing, right? So I'm in this and I'm explaining this to the city manager, and then I'm getting into my car to drive back to the base, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, if I buy a house, I know for the next 20 years, which is how long this project is, the government is going to pay the rent, no questions asked, it just comes. I got to do one of those. Right? So that was basically the first house that we bought for the purposes of investing, and not occupying ourselves. So that was a pretty big hammer, as you can imagine. So.
How long did it take from that first initial investment until you were able to jump into the second opportunity?
About 4 years.
Okay.
4 years later. And that was more a situation that I would call circumstantial. We bought a house, we lived in it, and then we got moved to another location. And the market situation, now that I knew a little more about it, it wouldn't have been smart to sell it. Right? We would have literally lost money. So it made sense to turn it into an investment property. And that was actually, for your audience, the thing that was interesting with that one is, and the first one was literally in our neighborhood, right? Like I was one of the military officers. A lot of people didn't want to live close to me, because who wants to live close to the boss, right? But it was at least within kind of like the same neighborhood. But then after I retired from the military, this second property that you asked about, that was really a matter of, okay, how do we do it when we're moving away and still want to make sure that the property is taken care of? And it was 900 miles away. It wasn't something where you say the faucet is dripping, I come by real quick, right? And so that was our first introduction to property management and how important that is. And I think we kind of lucked out, because I asked around a lot and people told me, yeah, there are all kinds of companies, but the best that everybody is raving about is this one. And they weren't the cheapest, but they were definitely the best. And we never had a problem.
Well, this is an interesting trajectory that you have been through in life. But all of those steps were somewhat incremental. Can you share with us a major crossroads in your life? It may have something to do with real estate, or it may be a major crossroad that had absolutely nothing to do with real estate.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, from the military, I retired because I couldn't do the flying anymore when I turned 40. You have to every year go through testing and medical evaluations, and the older you get, the harder it is to meet the standards. So in that sense, if you are in aviation, you get the option to decide, do you want to, what we call, fly a desk or retire? So I decided to retire, even though I'm flying a desk every day now. But I had kind of other visions, I guess. And so then the question was, okay, what do we do next? And I almost immediately, instantaneously got an offer for an executive role in a software company. And I thought, oh, this is going to be like a totally different life. I can apply what I learned, but get to know how the real world works outside of the gates and the protected environment of the military. And I have to say, I was quite disappointed after 4 years of doing that. And so there's maybe a theme, the way you asked the question. In this case, after the 4.5 years, it was obvious that this company could only really grow and be successful if it would make some significant changes. So we went to the owner, we meaning like the executive team went to the owner and said, okay, we think we need to really get together and come up with a new strategy and a new path. And he said, well, that sounds good, and I encourage you to do it. Take a day or two and do this, but I stay and keep everything running, and I also am responsible to the investor team. So we did literally a day and a half. At the end of the second day, had a meeting presenting our results and recommendations, and they said, oh, thank you for your great work, and we think about it and we get back to you. And literally we presented probably 5 p.m. local time, and the next morning at 9 a.m. an email came to all of us to say, well, thank you for your suggestions. The board has decided not to forward them and keep on the current path. And for all of us, I mean, we were 6 people. We basically knew if they didn't take even one thing, we basically had to leave, right? And so for me, that then the crossroads was really, what do I do? This, I still call this working as an employee like an intermezzo. But what it really meant for me was, okay, if I really want to do something different, if I want to really realize these things in my mind about serving people, providing some good services, helping to improve their life, I kind of got to be responsible myself. So in 2005, I started my own business, and the real estate stuff that we may or may not talk about today a little bit more came out of that, but way later, right? So I basically started a consulting business. I still run the business, and yeah, and I mean, it has all the fixings that you hear about when you become a business owner.
That truly was a major crossroads and a major transformation for you in your life. Share with us what it was like to actually go through that transition, and what were some of the major challenges and major obstacles that you had to confront and overcome.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. One thing that I would say for anybody who is kind of contemplating, or maybe because of the current circumstances this year, of feeling forced to at least consider that, I would highly, highly recommend, and wish I had been smart enough to know this, to find people or join groups that are experienced in small business and how to run a small business, how to start a small business, and so forth. And I don't even mean so much the mechanics, but more the aspect of, people glorifying business ownership in many ways, even to this day, in my view, which gives sometimes the impression that you only need to announce that you have a business and the customers will come, regardless whether what product or service you have, right? I mean, I had to learn this very quickly, that that's not the case. And I had no real preparation or real clue on how to go about it. The other thing that is, if you research it a little bit, you find that people say, okay, there are times where you're working on the business, and then there are times where you're working in the business. Meaning, like, you're delivering your services, you're developing something, you're getting your manufacturing, if you have a product going and stuff like that, versus creating a team, creating structures, getting your accounting and bookkeeping in place, setting either up marketing in some way, or being on sales calls and that kind of stuff. And so for me, I've even to this day sometimes feel there is a little bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul, that you really have to consciously make the decision, when is the time to work on the business and when is the time to work in the business. And one thing is, as a startup, I found there's only so many hours in the day, and even however much you might be motivated, it is really hard to do both. And the conundrum really starts when you have no team. You have worked on the business, so now you're gaining some clients, and you want to do naturally, you're so elated, you're so energized, you want to really, really help them with whatever you're offering. And you find that in this enthusiasm of helping them, there's nobody else anymore working on the business, right? And like in my case, I at the beginning provided learning and employee skill development services through the consulting, because I felt I had a lot of experience in that. I've always been educating and training people. I have a degree or multiple degrees in leadership and stuff like that. So I felt like I had a good combination of theory and academics and practice, and I wanted to make that available, and people started picking up on that. And it's then transitioning into what I would call a feast and famine situation, where as long as you're working on the business and you're gaining more business, that's great, because then you have revenue. And when you're starting to get into the delivery phase, nobody else is working on it anymore. And for me, there is really one very, very important lesson that I would like to point out, and also for your audience to realize, is one early question that I didn't answer because I didn't know that was an important question, is, are you planning to develop a business and run a business, or are you planning and developing a practice? And the distinction is really, if you develop a business, then the business idea, the vision, and what you want to do is basically what carries, and then you can drape and build a team around it that covers all these different areas of expertise that you need. Now, if you have a product and you can go to somebody and say, hey, I want to excite you about my product, and here is investing money, and then with the investing money, you can actually build the team. That's one way. The other is if it's more a service orientation and you say, as my revenue grows and I attract more clients, I can build a bigger and bigger team to deliver the services. It's very different in a practice, which is what I had to realize after a little while, that what I'm really having is not a business, even though people throw this always in the same basket or bucket, but it's really a practice. And the distinction is when you basically offer certain services like coaching, mentoring, training, facilitation, and all this kind of stuff that we offer. And you say, well, Alan is a great guy. I know he's worked with me. He has, 20 years experience. I'm serving client A and Alan would be perfect for client B. And you get the answer, yeah, I believe you, but we want to hire you and we know about you and we were getting referrals from your previous clients. We don't know Alan, and Alan might be the greatest guy ever, but we want you. That's a good indicator. It's kind of like, when your dentist says to you, I have a colleague who is going to do the work on you, and you say, no, my man, I want you or not, right? I keep my. So that's kind of a good indication of a practice, and that limits scalability, but that also then brings up the need to answer the question, okay, so if more and more people want my time for delivery, how can I then take care of the other side? Because I want to get away from this feast and famine cycle. And one solution, I'm suspecting you would ask me anyway, so the solution that I found to overcome this is to build relationship with organizations who make it their service to provide talent, right? So I've by now 5, maybe even more, I've not counted lately, organizations who go out, especially to larger clients, and say, hey, we can provide you with the talent that you need. Just tell us when you have a project that needs talent that you don't have or that you only need temporarily. And so for me, you could basically say, I outsourced my marketing and sales, right? And that way I can serve multiple clients and generate all the revenue and still have a practice and don't have to worry that while I'm doing that, nobody is basically helping to keep looking for new projects.
So at this point in time, do you consider that you have a business or do you still have a practice?
I would have to sadly admit that I have a practice.
What's sad about that?
It's not sellable.
It's
Normally when you work like I have for the last 15 years to build something and build all these relationships and have this massive volume of content, but if you consider the practice, the patients don't want to go to another doctor, so to speak, right? Or at least not easily. And so if you have a business and you have grown the revenue and you have a team that is basically glad when you're not in the building, that's something that is sellable, that has in and of itself the equity. Now, that doesn't mean that practices can never be sold, and it depends a little bit of what it is. But especially in the field that I'm in, it's much, much harder, right? Because it has a lot to do with your personality and what people are really interested in is how do you connect with them on the personal level, on the emotional level, on the interpersonal level, those kind of things. And everybody would be afraid that can we find somebody else who does it exactly that way, which is probably unlikely, And I'm sure, you have your style, I have my style, everybody here listening has their style. So just to say, okay, where can we find somebody exactly like that to put into this role if we buy this business? That's why I say it's probably not very easy, if at all sellable.
I've talked to a number of professionals, dentists, physicians, and other entrepreneurs who have essentially addressed this same issue, though they haven't necessarily used the same terminology, but they've certainly faced this same dilemma of coming to this point where they are exchanging essentially their time for money and finding that the scalability is just not there. So, what have you discovered in your own life? How have you changed this paradigm going from exchanging time from money to being able to have the time freedom to live the life that you want to live?
Well, in a way, in an indirect way, I have, and that is to say, okay, let's look a little bit at the term income and what's the purpose of income, right? And I don't want to divert too far away from it, but if fundamentally you have income first and foremost to cover your expenses, right? Or I sometimes talk about the personal balance sheet. So if that's true, then the next question becomes, okay, is this exchange of time for money the only way that I can cover my expenses? And what I found is partially through these hints by the universe that we spoke about earlier, that it's also possible, for example, through passive income, right? And so that's one thing that I started. I started investing more and more deliberately into real estate. And so, I'm starting to generate passive income, which then also means if somebody, for example, from these organizations that have that bench or these projects that they bring is, for example, not at the price or billing rate that I would look for, or if the project has certain aspects where I feel it's not ideal for what we want to do, or it's not the right time, or it takes whatever might be the criteria that are not perfect for what we do, that when the amount of passive income keeps increasing, the likelihood and the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to do this one is increasing as well. Or, which is what I'm doing now, is to literally say, okay, how many of those hours to exchange for money do I really want to do per week? And instead of doing 60, 70, 80, like I used to, I'm more back to like 30 to 40. Right. And so when you get to that, the only way to make that happen is, since especially in the area here around San Diego is not the cheapest place in the world, there needs to be another form of income coming in. And passive income through real estate investing is the form. And even to the point that Nadine contacted you mainly because we felt, okay, there might be people in your audience who say, okay, I don't want to work and exchange time for money forever. Right. And so I did this all basically after we started our consulting business in 2005, mainly as my maybe German way of saying, how can I create my own retirement? Right. In the sense to say at some point, the passive income will reach a level where I don't really have to exchange any time for money anymore. But then through the process and telling friends and colleagues about what I'm doing, more and more said, hey, you're doing a lot of things in a specific way that I'm sure other people would be interested in. Can you put it out there somewhere? Are you interested to help people? And I'm helping them. Yes, there is a fee if somebody really wants like hand holding, but it's really a joy for me to say, I love to help people to potentially get to a better life. And this is a vehicle to get there.
You have mentioned in some of your writings this aspect of a pivot point, and that pivot point being that point in time and place where you stop exchanging time for money and move to that point in time in your life when you really have that time freedom. So explain to us, what is that pivot point? Where do you find that pivot point? How do you know when you have reached that pivot point?
Well, the pivot point there are two actually in this context, the way you just set up the question. The one is the difference between what I call economic independence and financial independence. So economic independence is basically the point in time where your passive income completely 100% covers your expenses. Now, some people say my expense includes like 2 vacations a year or a fancy car, whatever it may be. So that is really very individual. Others just say, okay, it's my rent and my food and or my mortgage and those kind of things. So whatever do you define to all be inclusive for your expenses, and then having on the other side enough passive income coming in so that it's all covered. And you basically could say, okay, tomorrow I reach that point and now I become a painter or sculpture or something like that. So you can follow your passion and don't have to worry about covering your expenses anymore. So that pivots in what you do and how you can live your passion rather than having to in some way exchange time for money. The other one that I was addressing is, if you look at good habits in investing, and this is not just true in what we basically preach is out-of-state turnkey residential real estate investing, but fundamentally to say, whenever I put money into something, especially something tangible, like a real asset, then there are things that can go wrong with that asset. Now, when we take our example, like a house, and you purchase a house and you put tenants in the house, or your property manager puts tenants in the house, there are things that break. There's wear and tear and so forth. So there are basically three areas that are good caretaking things. One is not a tenant is not going to stay in your house forever, so there will be vacancy, and you need to have some reserve to cover vacancies and finding a new tenant. The second thing that can happen is just normal maintenance, right? Like the faucet is dripping or something needs to be repaired, wear and tear. And the third thing is called CapEx, or capital expenditure, which stands for, every so often, especially if your strategy is to keep a property for a longer term, you might need a new water heater, or you might need a new air conditioner, or you might need a new roof, or want to put a solar system on the roof. So those things that are significant expenses. But the other distinction is between maintenance and CapEx. Anything that you do in the CapEx area, if you were to appraise the property afterwards, it would actually raise in value. Right? If you have a property, one has an old roof, the other has a new roof, you get more in your appraisal for the one with a new roof. If you say my faucets aren't dripping because I just maintained them all, the appraiser is going to say, well, that's what I expect, and you don't get any extra for that, right? But so you have these three things, and I always recommend people should take 15% of the rental income and put that aside as a reserve. Now, the pivot point in that context is when you reach right around 5 properties or more. Because if you do the math, right, and if you think about it and you say, okay, I get $1,000 rent from every property, so I have 5, and 15% would be $150. So times 5, that's 5, that's like $750 a month. And you keep doing this over time, money accumulates, and at some point, the pivot point is reached, and I basically asked the question to when I started out, what's the most expensive thing that could break? And my experts in contracting all said roof. Roof is always the most expensive thing. I said, okay, so on these normal 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, 2-bath house, how much is a roof? And something kind of standard roof is about $6,000. Right. So now you say, okay, I have 5 properties. How many roofs are going to break all at the same time? Right. And so you get to a number, some people say $20,000, $30,000, that you want to accumulate over time with these $750 or more per month from these different properties until you reach that number. And that's the pivot point in that context, because if you were to keep going and you have $50, $60, $70, $80,000 sitting in that reserve account, are you going to have 8 roofs break all at once, or 12 water heaters or stuff? It becomes kind of silly. And there is some term, and I don't know if you want to dive into this, but there's a little bit a concept called velocity of money. And the slowest velocity is when your money is sitting in the bank account doing nothing, and especially now it's not even getting any interest or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Right? So yes, you want to, on the one hand, be maybe somewhat conservative and have a certain amount of money, so you're not getting all panicky because the storm came along and the roof needs repaired. But you don't want to have that 5, 6, 7 times over. So there is around 5 properties, and you had them for about a year or 2, you reach the point where your reserves, if you have no major other things happening, is big enough. Mm-hmm. And why that is a pivot point is now those 750 or however many multiples of your positive cash flow is additional income that comes into your pocket. Because you no longer have to put it away and have it in reserve. You can literally either use it for further investments or for consumption, which then gets you faster to this other pivot point that we mentioned earlier. If you say, okay, I live in an area where I need to get 4,000 a month, and so far I've always had 3,200. Now I reached the pivot point. Wow, now I'm slightly over 4,000. I can become a painter tomorrow, or whatever you like to do, sculptor or gardener, or whatever your passion is.
So if I understand this correctly, there's 2 considerations in terms of a pivot point. One is really the personal consideration, and what is your lifestyle and what do you need to maintain your particular lifestyle. And the other issue has to do essentially with the balance sheet. When we're talking about a passive investment opportunity, we have to look at the ratio of income to expenses. And what you are saying is that we can reach that pivot point with a commercial property when we come to that point of having essentially 5 units. And I think that primarily you're talking about single family units, but my question is, and I'm wondering if this 5 units is universal. Say, for instance, you have a 5-unit apartment complex. So do those same ratios apply to a 5-unit complex as they do to to 5 single-family homes?
Whether you have 5 individual single-family homes or you have one apartment complex and you have 5 apartments, the performance, what I like to apply, and I preach basically to the folks that want our mentoring or my help, is to initially apply. There's probably several dozen other factors, but purely on that point that you were bringing out, apply what's called the 1% rule. So if you get $1,000 rent, you want to get $1,000 rent for $100,000 investment. So you buy a $100,000 house, it needs to rent for $1,000. If you buy a $500,000 apartment complex, it needs to pay at least $5,000 rent. Now, in combined units, it's typically easier to meet or exceed that 1% rule, right? Because the ratio between the price and the rent is typically a little more favorable in apartment complexes versus single family. It's, on the other hand, also a little bit more risky, is what I call it, because as soon as your property or your asset has more than 4 what's called doors, right? So an apartment complex with 5 units, like you were saying, is considered a commercial property. Right. So the value is no longer based on what is the value of similar properties around the area. The value is only based on the rent roll, right? So if all these apartments in your 5-unit complex get $500, then the value of the property, however much you have done or the previous owner has done, is based on that in a multiple. That's why I typically like to stay away from this, and we don't actually have it in our portfolio or recommend it to other people. And this, I call it the Buffett Rule. And that is, do the stuff that you're probably familiar with, because most of us have or aspire to at some point live in a house, right? So we can understand the philosophy. How does a tenant look? Why would a tenant like to have a nicely renovated house for their family with a garage and a little garden and stuff like that? And if they had a choice, would they live in the apartment complex for $1,000 per unit or in the little house I offer them? Right? All those kind of things, familiarity, likelihood of finding tenants, and on and on and on. And then the other thing is, if at some point you ever come to the conclusion, you know what, one property or a certain, out of whatever reasons, I don't want that property anymore. It's not just that you need to find somebody who wants to invest in apartment complex or commercial properties. You might want to find somebody either that way or just a normal person who wants to have it for their own purposes. So the market in residential properties is massively, massively bigger than in these commercial investment properties. So it's in a sense, a risk management situation. But fundamentally, from a performance, to get back to your question, if you can find the same performance, the numbers work the same.
It's time to move to our final round of questions. But before we do that, share with our enlightened investors how it is that they can connect with you.
Yeah, what I basically believe very strongly about is, whether you're already investing or you're contemplating investing, especially in real estate, a lot of it has to do with the mindset. You have to value yourself properly. You should value yourself highly. You should encourage yourself to go after your dreams and after your goals, or what we call the big, hairy, audacious goal. And so in support of that, what we have created is I call it the mindset manual, that helps you to get into a positive, energetic mindset. And so you find that at our website, and that is www.idealwealthgrower.com/free. Or if you go to the website and wait for like 30 seconds, it pops up automatically, and it's going to ask you for a coupon code. So if you put in the word Alan under coupon code, then it basically sends you the PDF. And to make it a little bit more impactful, because some people told me recently, you know, it's great to have the manual, but I would like to understand more. I created an 8-part video series. So if you go on YouTube and put in Ideal Wealth Grower, you see the 8 parts of 8 different videos that support and kind of like track along the mindset manual, because there's a lot of exercises and stuff just to ask yourself, what's holding me back? What can I do to actually get to what I have in my mind, but I'm maybe afraid to do it, right? And so the videos and the manual together is basically what I think would be great for your audience, and it doesn't cost anything, and it hopefully helps you, especially for the upcoming new year to really find the energy to move forward.
Once again, Enlightened Investors, that website is www.idealwealthgrower.com. That's spelled IDEALWELTHGROWER.com. Enlightened Investors, head over to Axel's website. Lots of valuable resources there for your consumption. Let's move right into our final round of questions. So, what is your best piece of advice for the busy professional and entrepreneur who is interested in investing in passive real estate, but perhaps has never invested in real estate syndication before?
My advice would be find somebody who can help you with experience in exactly what you want to do. So if you, for example, want to join us in investing in residential real estate, find somebody like me or contact me. And the other important thing in this context is don't think that you can only start when you have hundreds of thousands of dollars in a savings account. The real starting point that we are looking for to achieve and get going is between $15,000 and $20,000. And a lot of people are quite surprised that with that relatively limited amount of money, you can get started.
Excellent advice. And every single guest I've had on the show here will concur with you that relationships are important, and certainly working with somebody with experience. Also, the other point you make is also good. You don't have to have mountains of money to begin your real estate investment experience. Our next question is, what is the one worst thing a novice or even a seasoned passive investor should avoid?
To buy something that you haven't actually seen in person. Don't let anybody tell you, oh, you don't need to come here, and oh, it's too far away, and we have pandemic and all these kind of things. You might call me super conservative. I want to at least once have touched the thing that I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on.
Some more excellent advice. I've certainly heard a number of horror stories in conjunction with people who didn't follow that particular advice. Our next question is, what do you wish I had asked you that I have not?
That's a great question. Well, you could have asked me what I would do when I reached my pivot points.
Well, Axel, what will you do when you reach your pivot point?
And Ellen, you had asked me that. Well, what I want to do when I reach my pivot point, hopefully soon, is to kind of replicate on a much smaller scale what I've done here in the Mediterranean, somewhere nice coastal thing in the Mediterranean, and get a little bit of that culture and paella and, bodegas and tapas. And
my last question is, imagine that you have lived a rich and meaningful life and now you're on your deathbed. As you reflect back on your life, what memories fill you with happiness, pride, and satisfaction?
Well, for me, it would be knowing that I have paved the way for my daughter to have basically a foundation through the properties that she will ultimately inherit that will make sure that she will never really have to strain very hard to reach the pivot point, and her kids and their kids probably wouldn't either.
Enlightened Investors, Axel has taken us on a journey from working in your business to working on your business, a journey from practice to shifting your paradigm to time freedom. For further resources in your own journey shifting the paradigm from practice to time freedom, head on over to steedtalker.com and pick up your free ebook, Passive Real Estate Investing, Time Freedom to Live Abundantly.
Thank you for joining us on Creekside Chats with Successful Real Estate Investors, brought to you by Steed Talker Capital. For more information, as well as access to our free ebook on enhancing your well-being through real estate investing, be sure to connect with us at steedtalker.com. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steed Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine and enhance the humane treatment of horses worldwide. Steed Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. Connect with us at steedtalker.com.
to be sure I understand this correctly, so either 5 single-family homes or a 5-unit apartment complex, the analysis and the ratios are essentially the same.